Welcome back to Animation Hustle, your daily dose of animation inspiration. In this video, I want to share some of my favorite viral shorts that I made recently. I try to find rare, funny, interesting, and inspirational stories behind making some of our favorite animated movies and TV shows. And stick around because the last one is really crazy. We find out why one animator had a terrible time working at Pixar. Before we jump in, I launched an Animation Hustle Discord, links below. Let's get into it. This guy accidentally directed a billion-dollar animated movie, but his first day on the job didn't go as expected.
And they all laughed at me.
This is a legendary story of how he learned an important behind-the-scenes secret about making animated movies.
And it's heartbreaking at first, but that's just how it is.
So this is Brad Abelson. He started animating on The Simpsons as a teenager, but that's not it. He created his own shows too. They were all comedies for adult audiences. So he was shocked when he was asked to be a director on The Minions.
And I was like me?
It was his first movie, so at the beginning, it was a huge problem.
I remember my first day on The Minions, was so excited. Then I was like, all right, well, here we go. We're making Minions 2. Like, where's the script? And they all laughed at me.
He quickly learned that making a movie was way different from the shows that he worked on, for one simple reason.
In primetime TV, we have a really brilliant script, and you stick to that script. In features, there's barely a script. It's kind of on you and the other storyboard artist and the director to kind of like try stuff.
Do you notice when animators do stuff like this? They sneak these funny drawings in and you hardly ever realize. It's hilarious, but doing this actually caused controversy behind the scenes.
They were always critical.
Pausing animation to find funny drawings is always entertaining. 1 second, you're watching a serious character. The next is this. But when older animators noticed this happening, they weren't happy.
Well, we wouldn't have done it that way.
Back in the day when the younger Disney animators started doing this, it absolutely shocked the older animators. It's not just funny faces either. These new animators weren't afraid to make their characters look kind of, well, ugly. I'll let Disney legend Glenn Keane explain.
After Little Mermaid, I said, so, what did you think? And Ollie said, there was times there where she just was not very appealing. There was some pretty ugly expression. And I realized, yeah, anytime we had a choice between pretty or real, we always chose real. Ariel was a real teenage girl with frustrations and anger and all those kinds of things. They were animating in a different era with a different taste. Ariel was much more in my time.
The first reaction to Adventure Time was hilarious. The studio executives were absolutely stunned.
Because I was like, Adventure Time, come on, grab your friends. And they were like,
this guy had no idea what he was doing.
I was just lucky. I'd never pitched before to a studio.
But here's the incredible story of how he tricked himself into making a hit animated show. So this is Penn Ward. At the time, he was a cartoonist looking for work. He wanted to create shows but had a huge problem. He never wants to work on what he should be working on, even when it's his own show.
I'll work on other drawing projects. When I'm supposed to be drawing for Adventure Time, I'll make comic books.
Basically, he's the king of procrastination. And the only way to get something done is to have a deadline. In order to come up with the idea for Adventure Time, he cranked up the pressure and did something crazy. Luckily, it worked out. He kind of did things backwards.
I can only work under pressure. I had to come up with an idea. I was scheduling pitches without an idea, and then I would try to that was like my deadline to come up with something and then pitch it. The deadline. When the deadline happens, I'll just crank all night.
Let me know if you also need a deadline to get things done. Making Moana almost broke Disney.
This movie was very much a struggle.
There were so many failures behind the scenes that they almost ran out of time to make the movie. This is the legendary story of how the entire studio locked in and at the last minute created one of the movie's best scenes. Okay, so here's a rundown. This is John Musker. He directed Moana and he explained how there were a lot of struggles making Moana. Like a lot. First, getting the characters' personalities right was a challenge.
Kept going around on her. How selfless is she? How selfish is she? Maui was a challenge because he was kind of an egomaniac and it was so unsympathetic.
But the hardest thing to get right wasn't what you might expect.
It's not the animation, it's not the ocean, it's not the tattoos. It's the friggin' story!
It was a team effort. Writers and directors from all over Disney came together to perfect the story. And they were working up to the last minute. Even with that deadline quickly approaching, they managed to create one of the best scenes.
Now the paint is still wet when the movie gets in theater sometimes, and one of the last sequences we animated was the Tamatoa song, Shiny.
Do you remember that scene in Coraline when we meet her dad for the first time? Well, Hollywood executives hated it, and here's why. So let's go back. So take a look at when Coraline is talking to her dad. He's not really paying attention, so she grabs the door and does this. It's a quick little funny scene, but it caused a lot of problems behind the scenes. So Coraline was a hard movie to make. The director, Henry Selick, is a stop-motion animation legend, and he wanted to do something completely different, and the studios did not like it.
It was considered too scary for kids, not scary enough for older teens and adults.
However, studios had real problems with moments like the door scene because they thought it was boring.
Executives are scared. They say, make it go faster.
Most animated films for kids are loud and frantic, but with Coraline, they chose to take time and let scenes breathe for a very important reason.
But we have our slower moments. There's time for ideas to sink in.
When Coraline is hanging on the door and the door is just going squeak, and it allows your brain to go, oh my God, that is what it's like to be a child. And if you don't allow there to be pace that's slower, you'll miss that entirely.
It shows that it's not a formulaic film.
These guys accidentally wrote the funniest scene in Disney animation history. This iconic scene went insanely viral, but the crazy story about how they created it makes everything even more legendary. So real quick, you remember this scene from Zootopia, right? It's great, but behind the scenes, it caused some problems. Everyone who heard the idea loved it, and it kept getting funnier and funnier.
We had a meeting about, well, what are some funny things in the city that animals could do? And she could meet a sloth that works at the DMV. And everything stopped.
This hilarious scene went viral, so you might think it took a lot of planning, but it turns out the scene was actually written super quickly.
I swear, like in that 90 minutes, we kind of performed out loud, verbatim, what the scene is right now.
This spontaneous energy was great, but it created a lot of problems when they had to animate it. I'll let the directors explain.
Then began the long journey of, okay, now we got a board and now we have to record it. And how do we keep that same spark? It's supposed to look spontaneous on the screen, but the process of animation, there could be nothing more non-spontaneous.
So this is one of the hardest things to animate. It looks simple, so you might think something like this or this would be harder. But really, even the best animators struggle to draw characters simply thinking. It's a challenge, but here's a mind-blowing example of how legendary Disney animators did it. So we all know animated characters aren't real, thank God. But the magic is how these simple lines on paper come together to create living characters that can do anything from this to this, or even this. Blinking and breathing help show life, but thinking is also really important. Well, most of the time. Sometimes characters are just dumb. To make his characters seem real, this Disney animator was inspired by real life.
We had to do an awful lot of work trying to work out how the bear would act, what gestures he would use. And I knew a guy in the army who used to scratch his chest when he was thinking.
This next one is crazy. Notice how the animator shows detailed thoughts with just a few subtle drawings. It's so good. Great animators always make the complicated things look so easy. Working at Pixar was an absolute nightmare.
I couldn't take being tortured like that.
The behind-the-scenes struggles got so bad, this legendary animator left the studio and disappeared from the industry for 10 years.
I kind of just sort of stepped away. It was one of the worst days of my life.
Okay, so let's go back. This dude is Henry Selick. He directed this and other stop-motion bangers. But after the massive success of Coraline, Pixar agreed to make his next project. But they had one rule.
The deal was if I could make this film for this much money, they'd support it artistically.
The movie could have been great. The idea was awesome.
It was called The Shadow King, a kid with the longest fingers in the world. He's taught to make hand shadows, and he can bring them to life.
But during production, he got to see that working for Pixar wasn't what he thought.
John Lasseter, who was in charge, he kept asking for change after change after change, to the point where the budget was going to creep up and go beyond what we'd agreed, and they shut it down.
But the story gets even crazier from there. Years later, after the management at Pixar changed, something unexpected happened.
That's a film that I might pick up again, because I got the rights back from Disney to The Shadow King.